Hey everyone, it's Coach Tippy's here, and this is a full in-depth Jax guide. Now, Jax has been one of my better champs throughout my career, and a champion that I'll often use when I'm pushing for rank 1 on the ladder, so I'm quite excited to show you guys what I've learned throughout the years, and really help you adapt some key concepts that will help you either learn or master the champion. So without wasting too much time, let's get started. The first topic we're going to be covering will be rune pages. Now, Jax does have two key rune pages, one being Lethal Tempo and the second being Grasp. However, I do want to say that Lethal Tempo is much better in solo queue and you should be taking it in the majority of your games, but we will cover when to take Grasp and when to take Tempo. Now, we'll go through every rune one by one, the first being Triumph. Now, you may have seen some Presence of Mind Jaxes. However, in my experience, cookies give you more than enough mana that having the extra skirmishing and team fighting power of Triumph more than makes up for the mana regen of Presence that you're missing out on. The second rune will take a bit of thought. You will need to see the entire enemy team comp before you decide. Now, I do want to preface it by saying Alacrity is a lot stronger in the sense that it'll help you stack your passive, your ulti, your lethal tempo itself, and it'll just increase your DPS by a lot, whereas this rune is mainly for surviving, right? Tenacity, and you'll need to see champions that give it value, such as Maokai, Sejuani, champs with a lot of just straight stuns, which are affected by tenacity. However, for the most part, you will be taking Alacrity and building Merchants if you need it, but keep in mind you will need tenacity versus high CC comps. For your third rune, you don't have much choice. I just want you to take Last Stand no matter what. And my reason for this is the times this gives you value, the times it's the difference maker between when you're low HP and you win a 1v1 or a skirmish and just survive. It just far outweighs the value you get from the other two, where you'll do slightly more damage to their Cho'Gath or you'll execute an already low HP enemy. That's just not impactful compared to winning a skirmish you'd otherwise lose and surviving on 1 HP. So the higher impact rune is Last Stand, and that's why you should be taking it in all of your games. Now for the second tree, it's pretty straightforward as well. I just want you to be taking Cookies and Cosmic Insight every game. And I especially want to touch on Cosmic Insight because this rune's popped up a lot this year and it's extremely overpowered. Now, the reason for that being is obviously the lower flash cooldown and teleport cooldown is nice across the entire landscape of the game, but the lower teleport cooldown early game for your laning phase can be extremely game ending. Now, I want you to picture, let's say at 5 minutes, you've been trading with your lane opponent, you both base, TP back to lane, ready to get stuck in again. Your TP, if you have this rune and they don't, is going to be up 1 minute before them. Yours will be up at 10 and theirs will be up at 11. So if you were to base at 10 on the dot and TP back to lane with your item advantage, they're now stuck in this lane versus you with low HP, low mana from the 5 minutes of trading and at an item deficit. So they're either going to base and walk back to lane, which during that time you're bashing the tower and getting plates, or they're going to try stay for a minute where they're open to getting dived or just straight killed 1v1. So for this reason alone, and also the impact lower flash cooldown has across the game, you should be taking this rune every game on Jax. For the second rune page, we have the Grasp page, and I do want to quickly touch on the fact that in solo queue, Lethal Tempo will be your better choice of rune for the majority of your games because the carry potential is much higher. And the reason you'll see Grasp so much in pro games is because it helps in the laning phase a lot in really hard matchups that you often see in these pro games. And also their teammates are really good, so they don't need the extra carry potential that Lethal Tempo will give them. So for the most part, unless you're an extremely high ranked solo queue player, I will recommend Lethal Tempo. But if you do like Grasp, these are the matchups you should be taking it in, and I'll go through it more later on in the video, how to use this rune to its fullest, but for now, I'll just explain why I take all of these runes in order. Up first we have Demolish. Now, of course out of these three runes, Demolish is the best by far on Jax. However, there's a strategy you can use to fully get the maximum potential out of this rune, which I'll go through later on in the video. But for now, just take my word for it and take Demolish. Moving on, for the second rune you have the choice between Second Wind and Bone Plating. Now, for the most part, you will be taking Second Wind as the rune is just stronger, and it'll give you a lot of value in poke matchups such as Gangplank and Jace. However, there are some times where bone plating is better. For example, if you're versus Riven, this champion, it can't pop the bone plating from range, and every time he dashes into you, he's probably going to use more than one hit. He's going to WQ auto, and you'll get a lot of value from the 3 shields from bone plating. And for the final rune in this tree, you have the choice between Overgrowth and Unflinching. However, for the most part, I would want you to just take the Overgrowth, as the extra HP you get scales a lot better than the negligible amount of tenacity you'll get from this rune. Where in a game where you need tenacity, you're probably going to build Merc Treads anyway, so stacking it with this rune has diminishing returns, which will make the HP you get from overgrowth more valuable in the long run. And for the second tree in this page, you'll be taking the same two runes as earlier, the first being Cookies for the mana regen, and of course, the best rune in League of Legends, Cosmic Insight, purely from the fact that the advantages you can gain from this rune are unmatched by anything else you could possibly take. Up next, we're going to be diving into summoner spells, and for your first summoner, I'm going to make it pretty easy for you. I just want you to take Flash in all of your games, and my reasoning for this is, even though in some cases TP Ignite may seem strong, it puts a massive target on your back for any enemy jungler that he's going to want to push you because he knows you can't flash any of his ganks, and you're going to be playing extra aggressive with that Ignite, so he'll see you as more of a free kill. And that doesn't mean your jungler is going to play towards you if you're pushing and playing aggressive. He might choose to play bot side or even around mid or dragon second. He can do whatever he wants and it's out of your control. So if you were to take Flash, for example, your result in your games will be a lot more consistent than trying to be super greedy with TP Ignite. Now the second summoner spell is going to take a bit more critical thinking on your part because there are variables depending on what rank you're in, what matchups you're in, or just whatever feels better for you. Some people, they feel really good taking Ignite compared to TP. However, I do want to go through the strengths and weaknesses of both to really help you make a more educated decision before you just default to one or the other. Now I'll start off talking about Teleport because this is the summoner I'd want you to take in upwards of 90% of your games. Now my reasoning for this is, it's such a consistent summoner that no matter what game you're in, how many games you play, in every game you take Teleport, you'll get value from this summoner. It's much more forgiving of mistakes. If you were to ever get ganked or take a bad trade, you can TP back whenever. And past 10 minutes in the game, now that they've dropped the, now you can teleport anywhere at 10 minutes as opposed to 14, you're going to be able to get either a bot playoff or, impact the map in some way, which you wouldn't be able to do with Ignite, which is purely for 1v1. Now, just because I rate TP highly doesn't mean I never want you to take Ignite. There are a few scenarios where the summoner will outvalue TP, and the best example of this is versus melee range champions that want to all-in you, that get a ton of value from healing. So the best two specific examples is Fiora and Gwen, because let's say you verse a Gwen and you jump on her head, she's either going to walk away and lose the trade, or fight you back, just pop her ulti and all-in. Now, having Ignite to cut her healing and the extra damage can be the difference between solo killing her or dying when you take these super aggressive trades. And if you were to shut down these champions for Fiora and Gwen, they're going to struggle a lot in the side lane, which will give you a much higher chance of carrying the game, because a 0-2 Fiora getting pushed in under tower is not going to do anything for his team. However, I do want you to factor in not to just take Ignite against all healing champions, because let's say you take it versus Dr. Mundo, for example. If you solo kill a Dr. Mundo, or if he kills you or anything like that, he's going to do the same thing. He's just going to group and team fight and be this meatball for his team. So the value you get from Ignite is a lot less versus team fighting champions than it is versus split pushers. Alright, now moving on to builds. Now for your starting item, it's either going to be either Doran's Blade or Doran's Shield. And an easy way for you to choose which one is think about the champ you're versing and think, will I be taking long trades or short trades in this matchup? Now, in a good example of a Doran's Blade matchup is versus Yasuo and Yone, where they're melee champions, where if you jump on them, they're either going to fight you back or walk away and let you beat their head in, right? In both of these cases, Doran's Blade will be better. And a good example for Doran's Shield matchup is Fiora, where you might think she's a melee champion as well, but recently Fioras have been taking Grasp and Scorch, and they just Q you and parry if you jump on their head. So the Doran Shield is really needed for these short trades they've been doing. So just think about long trades or short trades, Doran Blade or Doran Shield, but if you can't decide, always default to Doran Shield. It's more sustainable overall. Moving on to mythic items, I'll make it easy for you. I just want you to build Sundra almost every single time. And the reason for this being, even though Triforce might be better 5% of the time, you have to be really comfortable on Jax to play that playstyle. So if you're learning the champion and don't have high mastery on it, you should be going Sundra every time. And I will teach how to use Triforce later on in this video, but especially if you're beginning on Jax, I just want you to be building Sundra. The final thing I want to say about Mythic, and I put a lot of emphasis on this, is do not delay your Mythic unless you absolutely have to. And what I mean by this is, I see a lot of people buy a second Doran's or a Cull or, I don't know, Ninja Tabbies or something, which delays their Sundra by a lot. And I think this is just objectively wrong most of the time. The only time it's okay to delay your Mythic is when you need Merc trades in your matchup. And the only time you need them is versus Kennen and Gragas. Or if they have some weird combination like Maokai top, Sejuani jungle, then Merc trades is needed, right? But other than that, I want to see you rush your mythic as fast as possible every time. Moving on to boots, it's pretty straightforward, but there are a couple things I want to dive into. So, of course, if they have a lot of crowd control, you need Merc Treads. That's non-negotiable. You don't want to get CC'd to death on Jax, it's just too hard to play. And if they have a lot of physical damage, tabbies are useful. However, the thing about cooldown boots is the cooldown gets you extra ease off. So if you're versus champions like Graves, Lucian, this might actually make you tankier than tabbies because you might get an extra E off. And another factor is the price difference. So let's say you have all components of Sundra and tier 1 boots, and you base with 1350 gold. That's enough to buy the finished Sundra and cooldown boots, where if you're waiting for tabbies, you'd be coming out of base with a ninja cloth armor and Sundra, which is just not as much of a spike as cooldown boots Sundra. So if you base with a certain amount of gold to finish your mythic and get the cooldown boots, and you don't need the merc treads, then I'd go cooldown over tabbies every time. Alright, now moving on to second item, you do have a few choices, so bear with me, I'll explain it the best I can. For the most part, you want to be defaulting to either Spear of Shojin or Black Cleaver, because CDR is vital on Jax for getting as many E's and Q's off as you can, his two main abilities, and also the HP you get from these items is underrated because you get a lot of resistances from Jax's ultimate. So that's why you'll see a lot of Jaxes just build hit points and not stack armor and MR, because he gets all the resist he needs from his ulti for the most part. So I would go one of these two items if you're ever unsure what to buy. These are the staple. As for Hullbreaker, I'd only ever buy this in a game where you tab and you just think to yourself, there is no way we're winning a team fight this game. My team is way too far behind, or the enemy comp is way too good at team fighting. They have Malphite Orianna, something like this, where with the Hullbreaker, you might be able to start breaking the tier 2, the tier 3 tower, because a champ like Malphite or Vladimir or something, they're good at team fighting, but they can't really deal with your side lane pressure, and they can't kill the enhanced cannon minion as well as a physical damage champ. So that's the only time I'd go Hullbreaker this early on into the game. Now for the Wits End and the Bork, I would only buy these when you're versus champions that are going to contest you in the side lane 1v1. So for example, for Wits End, if you're versus a Gwen, AP champion that's going to fight you in side lane, another split pusher, Wits End's extremely valuable because you get the magic resist, the attack speed on hit, everything that synergizes with your kit. And even though you're missing the HP and cooldown reduction, those stats are better in team fighting than 1v1 anyway. So even if you were to build Black Cleaver in a better team fight, if you're losing the side lane, it doesn't matter. He can keep you stuck under your tower if he's good at the game. So I'd build Wits End versus champions like that. And for Bork, I'd build it versus hard AD split pushes, such as, Fiora. Unless you're ahead of her and you can beat her with Bork, Black Cleaver anyway. Bork might change the scope of that 1v1. Say you're 0-1, you've had a bad start, you died to a gank. You might be able to beat him with Bork Sundra versus Sundra Hydra if you play better than him, because Bork is a pure 1v1 item. You're going to be trash at team fighting, but if you can kill their strong Fiora in the side lane, you have a way better chance of winning the game than, trying to catch up to a team fight where Fiora has push. Alright, for the third item, you have quite a lot of choices, so I'll go through them for you. For Hullbreaker, you should only buy this as a third item if you're already getting a lot of work done in the side lane, because it's going to amplify what you're already doing and help you start breaking these inhibs faster. If you haven't done anything in the side lane, you shouldn't randomly buy this item and start really late into the game, because if 3 items is probably past 25 minutes into the game, unless you're 10-0, then it doesn't matter. But if you're buying a Hullbreaker that late into the game and you haven't done anything in side lane, there's no point buying it now. For Frozen Heart, just buy it versus heavy AD comps that have a lot of auto attackers where the passive is useful, because the cooldown reduction will always be useful for you, but the passive, you need to make sure it's useful before you buy this over another armor item. And for Wits End, it should be the same as the second item when you verse an AP side laner that's giving you trouble. Like maybe the Gwen was behind early game, but he came back at this point in the game. You'll need the Wits End to deal with him. For Zhonya's, I'd be extremely careful, because this item is extremely good on Grasp Jax. You should get it every game on Grasp Jax as third item in my opinion, but on Lethal Tempo Jax, I think it's a bait, because you can't use your lethal tempo with AP and armor, right? It doesn't amplify what the rune you take wants to do. I'd only buy this on Tempo Jax versus high burst comps like Karthus Z, something like that. For the Abyssal Mask, this is pretty rare. I almost never buy this because it relies on two things. You need an AP teammate that's carrying the game, and the enemy needs to have a lot of AP champs that are giving you trouble, and also it needs to be a perma team fighting game. So that's when you buy that item, but don't tunnel on it too hard. I'd always prefer Wits End, especially in lower elos. And for Shojin, you just buy it in games where you didn't buy cooldown reduction second, because you do need CDR in your build by third item. So if you bought like a Wits in second, then I want to see Shojin third out of you. But yeah, other than that, the rest of the items depend on how the game state's going, and I've explained when to get which item, and that applies for fourth and fifth item and so on. So hopefully you can use this knowledge to help you build, and if you struggle with thinking about it in the game, then if you follow these full build examples down below, you'll get value from it regardless. However, I do recommend, as you get more comfortable on Jax, experimenting with the different items at different times and seeing what feels best for you. So now let's move on to the matchups part of the guide, and I would like to preface this by saying that this tier list is based on how the matchup should go at the highest level of challenger, and not to get discouraged if you're to verse a champion that's in the hard tier, because you can win all of these matchups. 99% of the time, you can win your lane on Jax if you play better than your opponent, but I can give you some tips that will help you in the harder matchups. Now, a really good concept you can keep in mind when you're versing a lot of the hard champions is that if you're unable to pressure the solo kill, there's a lot of value in staying extremely high HP so that your jungler can interfere with the lane. Now, for example, there's Kennen, Rumble, Quinn. These champions are really immobile, and for the most part, they don't have a gap closer. And their only hope is to poke you down low enough until they can finish you off with a kill or dive you with their jungler. However, if you're to stay extremely high HP, and they're playing aggressive under your tower, then your jungler can come and kill them at any time if you hold all your spells before they arrive, and you're not low enough that the gank can get turned. Because for the most part, depending on what both the jungle champions are, Jax is still stronger in the 2v2 setting than a champion like a level 3 Kennen. So as long as you're not low HP under tower trying to get your jungler to bail you out, the resources are extremely valuable in these melee vs range matchups. Now the next advice I want to give you, and it's perhaps the most important in terms of helping you win your lane, is plan when you want to take your first base. Now, for example, in a lot of these hard matchups, you can actually get pushed level 1 even though you're counterpicked, just because of how strong Jax's E is if you manage to stun all the creeps. So I'm going to pick Kennen for a good example. Even though it's a counter matchup, and most times if you see that matchup in your game, the Kennen will probably win. If you were to plan your bases really well, you can win this matchup. So the best way to play this matchup is to get pushed level 1 by Eing all the creeps after blocking some Kennen autos, because it'll give you extra damage. And then using that, you'll get level 2 first, where you can trade on him, or if he respects, you slowly push in wave 2 and 3 together, crash wave 3, and walk back to lane with your null magic. Now, it's important to walk back to lane and save your TP, because at level 3 and 4 and 5 is when Kennen starts winning the matchup, and you're going to need to base later on, once he's done more and more damage to you, around 5 minutes, 5 minutes 30, when you've got enough of your Merc Treads to combine that null magic, and you'll TP back to lane, level 6 spike, Merc Tread spike. You can actually look to all in him and win the lane at that point of the game. Now, if you manage to somehow get a solo kill, burn his flash, chunk him, or just make the lane stay really hard for him, you've won this matchup, even though in theory, Kennen should win. But if you plan your bases really well, you can win any of these matchups. So yeah, we're going to leave it at that, and later on in the video, in the laning part, we're going to go more in detail of how to win these lanes. But for now, I just want you to keep those two key concepts in mind when you play any matchup, but ideally the hard ones, and hopefully that'll help you start winning some matchups that you'd otherwise lose. Alright, next we're going to go through the best time to pick Jax. Let's say you have a few champions in your pool, and you want to know when you would pick Jax over the other ones. Say you're playing Clash with your boys, or just even in solo queue if you have a pretty good champ pool. There's some things you can look out for to know when it's best to pick Jax. The main two factors for whether Jax is a good pick or not depend on what I've got on the screen here, the mid and jungle champions and what they want to do in the game. And the reason it's mid jungle and not bot lane is because for the most part, the enemy bot is going to be composed of a range 80 carry and either a tank support or an enchanter that want to peel you off the 80 carry. So even though Jax is better in certain bot lane combos such as just Samira then Vayne, that's not really effective for picking him, because if you can snowball early and get fed, enemy 80 carry, no matter what champion it is going to have trouble versing you. To dive in deeper to this point, Jax, stylistically as a champion, he wants to get ahead. He wants to get fed and have full dominance in the side lane and use that to either break structures or threaten their enemy team and maybe even collapse on them in a team fight if it looks favorable, right? That's Jax's identity. The main point being he wants to get fed early game. And that's why all of these champions I've got written down here, that are good with Jax, help him achieve that. Sejuani, her passive CC, like she doesn't need to farm that much, she can help him. Just the best jungle to have with Jax. That's why you see even in LCK, LPL, they'll pick these two champions first three in the draft a lot of the time together because they synergize so well, even at the top level of play. And for mid, you want champions that can push and roam and help you get ahead. And the best two I've got written down are TF and Galio because these champions, their whole identity is roaming, right? Look at their ultis. It's literally just move from mid lane to the side, basically early game. That's all they want to do. And with Jax, you want to be looking to snowball early, trade really aggressively in your lane, and these champs can help facilitate that. And the reason I have the enemy champs here listed as effective when Jax is good to pick is, in my opinion, it's even more important than the champs on your team because let's say, for example, you have Jax Sejuani top jungle and solo queue, and your gold platinum game doesn't matter, and the Sejuani decides he just wants to camp bot. That's what he thinks is best. Then you can't even use your combo at all. So if you pick Jax just for that Sedge, it doesn't matter because he can play however he wants. He doesn't have to go near you. But if you verse an enemy Master Yi, and you're doing well in the game, you're 2-0, you're breaking his tower, he's going to have to interact with you at some point, or you're going to end the game, and your E completely blocks all his auto attacks, so even if he's 2-0, 3-0, and you have enough cooldown reduction to maintain your E's, he's not going to be able to touch you in the side lane. So that's why I think the enemy champs are more important than the champs on your team. And to dive in more to the mid lane champs, Twisted Fate, for example, he wants to gank side, and in team fights, his only self-peel, he has no gap closer, his only peel is a stun card. And your E completely blocks TF stun, so there's nothing he can do if you jump on his head. There's nothing you can do if you're side laning and you have a lot of discipline with your E. He can't just ulti and stun you. So I think, in particular, TF and Akshan for mid, but mainly champions that, like I've written here, side laning champs that can't handle you. Jax becomes really valuable, but for me, as a solo queue player, I prefer seeing the jungler before Jax. I think Jax is really good, like Graves, Yi, Kindred. These auto-attacking junglers that make it hard to gank you if you hold your E. To finish off the drafting segment, I want to run through a quick draft review to really help you visualize when it's good to pick Jax. So let's say, for example, your jungler blind Sejuani, because he's a Chad, he doesn't care about the matchups. And they counter with something strong early like Nidalee and some strong meta champ, Kai'Sa. Your bot lane should respond in turn. Let's say Zeri Nort, just two good champs, and they answer support. Now from this point you should be thinking, alright, Jax is pretty good, I've got Sejuani synergy, and my bot lane's pretty self-sufficient, you know, there's no Draven, Samira, they're not going to fight 24/7, so if Sedge was to gank for me, it'd be pretty good for the game state. But I don't want you to fall into the trap of, alright, I've seen one champ Jax is good with, let's pick it no matter what, because they can pivot to make your game really difficult. So let's say, for example, they go Akshan mid, or top, doesn't matter. No matter what in this game, Jax is going to be useful. They have 280 carries and Nidalee, who's just range auto attacking basically. Jax is extremely valuable from this point, but if they were to pick something like Cassiopeia, and you pick Jax anyway, and then they counterpick you, this game can be really hard for you, because they have a lot of disengage and damage and peel, and it's not like you can destroy Jace in the side lane, unless you've got a lead already. So this is an example where Jax could be risky to pick, but if you're truly good at Jax, you'll find value in this game because there's a reason he's one of the top meta blind picks, right? He can always be useful, but it's just something to keep in mind that you'll be more useful if you see a draft like this. Okay, now we'll move on to the gameplay aspect of Jax, and we'll start this with level 1 since it's the starting point of every game. So the main two concepts I want you to take away from this segment is you either want to be getting a cheese off on Jax, and I'll show you the best 4 spots shortly, or if you're playing lane normally, you can't get your cheese off, you want to try get behind them with your E level 1 and chase them down the lane with it, because most champions level 1, their damage comes from their auto attacks since they only have one ability. So with Jax, his E obviously blocks auto attacks, so if you can get behind them, that means you can get even more autos off than if you'll just run straight at them from the front, where they can easily cut you out. There are 4 main bushes you can look to take over level 1 to try to gain an advantage or get a cheese off, whatever you want to call it. And the best ones are always going to be on blue side because of the way the map is made. The cheeses are more effective on blue. And the best one is always the enemy tri-bush, like we have here on the screen. If you look on the minimap, that's where Jax is sitting. And the reason for this being is, especially in solo queue, especially the lower ranks you go, junglers often want to leash. And if the enemy top leashes and he walks back through the tri and you're sitting in there, you're going to get a lot of damage off onto him and maybe even burn his flash. So especially in solo queue, this tri-bush cheese is really effective as opposed to pro play. but I will warn you not to use your E as soon as you see him walk into the bush, because for starters, he might not even expect you're there, so he won't turn to auto attack you, and your E is kind of wasted. And secondary, the way Jax's E works is the more auto attacks you block, the more damage it does. So it has a cap, but for the most part, you want them to get an auto or two off onto you. So you want to time your E for when they turn to hit you. And if they don't hit you at all, you can pop your E if they're good, but for the most part, you want to be holding that spell. And in the scenario where they don't face check that bush, either they don't leash or they walk the long way around, you want to be applying the second concept I went over, which is trying to get behind them level 1 with your E to get the maximum amount of auto attacks down. So we see here, been waiting in this tri-bush, hoping the Shy checks him. But the Shy's a good player, right? He's not going to face check this Jax like a solo Q Jace might. So he decides to implement the second part, which is walk behind him. Now you'll notice here, he waits for all the minions to settle before he tries to walk behind him, because he doesn't want the minions chasing him down the lane and ruining his minion control. So once the minions are settled, he decides to walk behind the Jace. But it doesn't go as well as it might versus a worse player, because his Jace is good and he adapts on the fly and skills E and uses it to kite out the Jax. However, even though the trade doesn't go as good as he expected, he's still now, because Jace had to skill E and take a trade, he now gets push in this hard range matchup where maybe if the Jax just walked in from the front and got poked by the Jace, he wouldn't be able to get push. But now he's got full control of the bushes. Jace had to waste his ward level 1 as well for this bush, which is another key point, because melee versus range matchup, you're quite scared of the jungler. So if you make the range champion use his ward, it's really important. And now Jax gets level 2 first. He gets control of the wave. And now his jungler's pathing up. And he can use the push he gained from him trying to cheese level 1, which didn't work, but adapting and getting behind him level 1 to get control of the wave. And in another game, he'd get an even better trade-off, but against a good player, control of the wave is enough. And they use this to net a kill on the Jace. Now, I will say you shouldn't expect your jungler to path up in solo queue, like in a pro team, even if you get a really good level 1 off, but the option is there for them due to the way Bin played level 1. The next bush on blue side is the third lane bush. Now, you want to be using this bush to get behind them level 1 after all the minions have settled, because, like I said before, you don't want to ruin the minion wave by having them chase you down the lane when they're not settled down. And also, when they're all settled and you walk out and start hitting them, the casters will turn and hit you, and if you have your E on, you want the casters to be hitting you because it'll make your E do even more damage, and then you can stun the enemy champion and the caster creeps, and the minion aggro will drop completely off of you if you've stunned them. So I will say make sure the minion wave is settled before you do this, and also don't just run here level 1 at 30 seconds into the game and wait for the whole minute. You want to still be fanning out and guarding your jungler so that they can't invade his blue, and then you want to be hitting into this bush at around, like Bin does here, 126, 127, whenever, before the minions have a chance to reveal you. Now on red side, there's 2 bushes you can use, and the bushes will be this one and this one. I don't want to talk about this bush too much because it's the same concept as this one. You enter it around 125, and you look to walk behind them and stun them with the creeps, right? We just went over this one. So I want to talk more about this bush because it's got a unique factor that the other ones don't. And that factor is, at level 1, when everyone has home guards and running out of base straight away, if you run here as fast as you can to this rock here, you can see if the enemy top laner enters the bush or not. Now the reason that's important is if they don't enter the bush, you can and take it over. So now, if they leash or even walking back to lane, if they check you, they're going to take a really bad trade. And also, you can get, if they don't check you, you know they're going to walk through here no matter what, right? There's no other way back into the lane, which means you can get a really good ward here, which spots jungler and spots if they leash, spots basically everything you need to know. And then, if they're not walking back through here, after you've placed your ward, you can look to walk behind them here and get a really good trade-off. Now, I do want to say, make sure they don't see you place the ward here, because then the jungler can look to gank you from behind, and it makes it really hard for you to get your wave pushed in. So you see here, he doesn't realize I've taken over his bush, and he takes a really bad trade, loses 150 and bone plating, which in Jax matchups is really important. So it just changes how the matchup should be played out. Moving on to the red side, the 2 main bushes you want to look to take over are this bush and this bush. And I won't go into this bush too much because it's the same as this one that we just covered, right? You enter at 125, wait for the minion wave to settle, and look to walk behind them and get a good trade-off where you stun the creeps. We've already gone through that one. But the main difference between the first 3 bushes we've gone through and this one is that at level 1, when everyone has home guards, as red side top lane, if you run here as fast as you can, you'll see if they enter this bush or not. And if the reason that's important is because if they don't enter this bush, like in this clip here, now you've got full control of this bush. And the reason this bush is extremely OP is because if you have a strong level 1, like Jax does, if they choose to enter this bush trying to get back to lane or after they leash, they're going to take a really bad trade. And if they don't enter this bush, you'll ward here, and you'll see what the enemy jungler's doing, of course, and you'll see if they're walking back to lane late. And if they're not walking back to lane, you look to take over this part of the terrain, where if they've leashed and they've walked back through here, now the minion wave's here, you're standing here, they're walking back to lane, they're going to take a really bad trade trying to get any CS, right? So, all because of the information gained from level 1, you're already in a favorable position. But I will say more often than not, they will probably check you after leashing, or they'll just check you walking back to lane, where you can get a really good trade-off. Now, the trade might not look like much, but in this matchup, if Renekton has got high level mastery of his champion, he can get pushed in this matchup. Now, because he's lost bone plating and 150 HP, now I'll get pushed and my early game is a lot free versus a strong early game champion like Renekton. So, looking to take over this bush level 1 is extremely important, and if you can't, then you can always default to this one. But I do want to put a lot of emphasis on, you don't win level 1 against every champ in the game on Jax. There are certain champions that will beat you, such as Olaf or Set, and I guess I'll just put a list of those champions on the screen, so if you see those champions level 1, you should be less inclined to try to cheese them, but 9 times out of 10, the champion you're versing, you'll beat them level 1, so this is a good way to get an early game advantage. Okay, moving on to the most fun part of League, which is laning phase. Now, there's something a lot of people don't understand about Jax, which is, if you get up to your Divine Sundera without dying to a gank, without losing XP, staying 10 CS per minute, you're extremely happy with that game state. You don't have to be getting 5 solo kills or stomping the first 10 minutes of the game. That can come later after you've spiked. But for the early game, keeping it stable is extremely important. It doesn't mean you need to play passive for any means, but it does mean don't feel pressured to get a solo kill every couple minutes. You can stabilize the game, get your Sundera, and then look to carry the game. And the best way to do that is to come into each game with a plan for how you want to play level 1 to 3. As soon as champ select's done, you should be thinking, how do I want to play out my lane phase to gain me an advantage, or at least stay even for the first sequence. The first sequence being the first part of the lane before you recall. So for this game, for example, I'm versus Poppy, who is a counter to Jax, a neutralizing pick, but my level 1 is stronger. I tried to use my level 1 here, but he did take this push over level 1, so I was unable to get a cheese off. So the lane phase starts off pretty normal. So I use my E to counter his passive throw and stun all of the minions. I missed one, but for the most part, you want to be stunning all the minions level 1s to guarantee push in matchups where they may be able to push back. Say versus Kayle, it's unlikely he can push back, so you don't need to stun every minion, but for the most part, you want to be damaging the level 1 wave as much as you can with your E, and then last hitting slowly in correspondence to what they're doing. If they're hard pushing, you might need to auto quickly, but if they're just last hitting, you can just last hit. Now for wave 2, I wouldn't recommend pushing this one too fast unless you can get a really good trade. The reason for that being is, first, stronger champions or champions that can look to freeze it here, they can make your time really tough, and ideally crashing wave 3 or 4 is better because it's a cannon wave. However though, if you can see an angle for a good trade and you can crash wave 2 extremely fast, then it's fine. The reason it should be crashed fast is because if you crash wave 2 too slowly, then Poppy can look to freeze it here until his minions arrive and block it here, and then he can trade on you and you can't trade back. But if you can eat all the creeps and him, get a good trade, and push wave 2 in very quickly, then you can use that time to get a ward off and it's not too bad. Now normally, if you don't crash wave 2, you want to stack wave 2 and 3 together and crash it under tower, but in that instance you do crash wave 2, then you want to stack wave 3 and 4 together. So I get a good trade off, I eat him and all the creeps, and I last it really slowly, waiting for wave 4, and now the lane's over for him. My jungler chose to path bot, but in another game where he's up, we could look to dive him. But for this game, where there's no jungler intervention for me, I'm going to look to proxy him. Now, the reason I can proxy him is because I watered this level 1, so I know his blue and Grump is gone. Not level 1, sorry, after wave 2. And I've taken really good trades where if he eats me into this wall, it's not even a big deal. I can still walk past and get to the wave. So I even greed here to get a demolish proc, which pre 5 minutes demolish proc doesn't do too much, but it's more of a style points kind of thing. If you can get away with it, you can do it. But your main objective is clearing this wave here. Now the reason I think it's really overpowered to clear the wave here instead of just say here is it takes the wave an extra 10 to 15 seconds to get from here to here, which is 10 to 15 seconds you could be bashing the wave, right? But if you clear the wave here using Jax's E and you base, now you're coming back to lane pretty similar time to your wave, just a few seconds behind. And if he tries to push this, you'll be back in lane in time before he crashes it, and you've got item advantage, you've got full HP. He has to base. Now, purely from me coming to this game with a game plan, my wave is in a good spot, and I've got teleport advantage in a counter matchup. So this is a good example of coming into a game with a plan. And in solo queue, you should be able to get even more advantage than just TP advantage, but for the most part, if you have a plan and they don't, you will gain something. Now from this point in the game, I'm thinking to myself, okay, I've gained TP advantage level 1 to 3. How can I use this to gain an advantage? And the way you do that is you want to be trading as aggressively as possible, because if you have TP and they don't, and you trade hard and you're both low HP, you can just base and TP back to lane, and they're stuck with their low resources. So see here, I ward just to ensure I can trade aggressively on this timer without getting ganked, and then I trade as aggressively as possible. Now, even though the trades aren't that favorable for me, or about the same HP, it doesn't matter because I base and teleport back to lane, and I can look to all in him with the HP difference and item difference. Now because of the item advantage, I win the trade so hard he ends up having to base, or he's going to get dived. Now this gives me full control of hitting plates, controlling the river, eating fruit, warding, everything I want to do purely from the level 1 to 3. So this is a good example of how having a good plan can get you an advantage. Even 7 minutes into the game, I'm still gaining an advantage from that TP advantage, right? So if you have a plan, especially when you're in a game versus not 5 pro players, if you're in a solo queue game, you're going to get even more of an advantage than I did. But the overarching concept is if you have this game plan in mind, you will gain something 9 times out of 10. Okay, now I want to showcase a matchup where Jax doesn't necessarily get pushed. I will say in solo queue, however, that 9 times out of 10 versus bad Renekton's, you can just ego the push by eating them and all of the minions, but for the most part, if the Renekton's really good, he can get pushed if he wants. So Bin comes into the lane. He doesn't E straight away because he wants to follow the concept of walking behind them with the E, right, to get more auto attacks. And the best way to get behind them, if you can't get a cheese off from the bushes, is to wait for them to go for a last hit, which Renekton does here. So as soon as Renekton goes for his last hit, Bin steps up on him and starts Eing and autoing him down. Now as soon as Bin does this trade, he realizes, okay, the trade was good, I got bone plating, but my E didn't hit any of the wave, which means Renekton can now get pushed. Because Renekton can choose to Q all the creeps if he wants, and Jax E cooldown is much longer than Renekton Q. So there's no way he will get pushed. So what he does instead is he tries to thin the wave out, meaning he tries to kill as many minions as possible, damages it with E, plays really aggressively, so now Renekton's thinking, okay, Jax has no E, I'm going to be aggressive on him. But Jax only fights him in the wave for 2 reasons. Obviously, 1, he wants the minions to hit him back. But 2, he wants Renekton to damage the wave as much as possible and force him to crash wave 2. And the reason this is good is because Renekton pushed wave 2 instead of stacking it with wave 3, which is the cannon wave. And the cannon wave, you can't freeze it very easily because it does so much damage and it's so big. But wave 2, it's quite easy to freeze, especially on Jax with your E. But in this game, he doesn't even need it because Renekton pushed crash wave 2 too slowly. So now, he can look to aggressively trade on this Renekton and step back to tower if he has to, and Renekton can't really do anything. See, every time he's getting this trade-off, Renekton can't just dash onto him, he'll be near tower, It's extremely risky for him, and he's vulnerable to ganks in another game where he's not versus a Wukong. And Jax just wants to keep this lane state like this and keep trading on him as aggressively as possible. And eventually, he bases and TPs as his wave comes in. And the reason he's TPing on this timer is because Renekton can't queue all of these creeps until they've all settled, right? It's hard for him to push until they've left the tower range. So now Renekton's panicked. He's trying to push it in before Jax gets back to lane. But because Jax based a really good timer, he can't. And he's able to come back and maintain his freeze. So now Renekton in this winning matchup, a counterpick to Jax in lane phase, just getting destroyed in these trades. And the wave is still frozen outside his tower. Renekton wants to be getting jungle resources, but he can't get any because the wave state's been like this for 4 minutes now. And Jax maintains his freeze. Renekton has to TP, so he can't use TP advantage like in the last scenario to trade and TP back. And he's losing experience from these minions dying to the other minions. On top of that, another benefit Jax is getting is now, because Renekton was out of the lane for so long to match his TP, he can stack this really big wave into tower, trade aggressively with the minion and level advantage, and then get a dive off of his jungler. So I hope this helps you guys see that even in losing matchups, if you have a good game plan, you will still get an advantage. As soon as Bin saw the level 1, that Renekton was going to get pushed, his game plan was, okay, from this point, I want Renekton to crash wave 2 so I can freeze it. And that's exactly what happened. Up next we have combos. Now Jax's kit is pretty simple, there's not a lot of combos you need to memorize, but there are a few that you should definitely practice before you head into your ranked games. We'll start with his easy combos, and the easiest of all of them is the fact that his W is an auto attack reset. It's not really a combo per se, but it's definitely something you need to know before you start playing Jax. The extra damage you get from resetting your auto makes the W much more valuable, and there's a huge reason why Jax should max W first always. You're going to be stacking your ulti off a minion by hitting it twice, and then jumping up to the enemy champion and getting the extra damage down. Now, I will add the next level to this when you're more comfortable, as you don't even need to auto attack twice, right? You can just auto a minion once, Q onto him, and then auto W. That's all 3 hits off, one from the minion, 2 on the champ, and it's much harder for them to react to it than if you're stacking on a minion with 2 hits. And the final easy combo is normally when you're before level 6, so you'll start with E, Q, E, auto W, and yeah, that's a basic trading combo. You'd walk away normally or chase down for the all-in, but that's pretty straightforward for a pre-6 combo. For the intermediate combo, this one's for when you're after level 6. You'll start the same way as the earlier one, E, and then Q, E, R, auto W. The main part about this combo is you need to make sure you get your R off before you auto and W, because after ulting, it procs every 2 hits, not 3. So any auto attack you're doing before you ult is much less efficient than after. And for the final combo, the hard Jax combo, you want to start with E, and then R flash E auto W Q. Obviously you can hold your Q if they're not going to kill them with this combo, but the hardest part about this combo that you should practice in practice tool is getting the R flash off into E instantly, because if you don't do the R and the E at the same time, there's a chance they can flash the R damage. And also just using R flash in general takes a bit of practice, so to run through it one more time, you can start with E, R flash E auto W, and then Q is optional depending on what you see in the game. But yeah, this is definitely a combo I recommend practicing a few times before you head into your games. To finish off this part of the video, even though it's not so much a combo, there's just a couple of things I wanted to show you to just make your Jax a bit more smooth. So firstly, once you have Sheen or any Sheen item, once you're bashing the tower down, you'll notice once you W the tower, it's holding onto your W this whole time, so you can't be spamming it to proc the Sheen. And eventually you'll just go on a full cooldown. But the way to counteract this is once you W, you wait for the Sheen to come back, Q a minion. This will remove the W, putting it back on cooldown, and also giving you another Sheen proc from your Q, which you can use on the tower, and then you'll use the next Sheen proc for another W. So if you can do this consistently, your DPS to towers will be much higher, but you do need to keep in mind you're queuing a minion, so if someone comes, you won't have your escape, so only do this when it's absolutely free. And the last little trick I want to show you is mainly for camp efficiency. Say you're strong later on in the game, you're pushing down side and you're eating their Krugs, but you want to get a base off after Krugs. A way that can make your base slightly faster, as soon as all the small Krugs are here, you start your E and base instantly. Now they can't cancel your base because their E's blocking, and eventually your E will pop and kill them all. This is not really a big thing, but it's just a cool little trick that will save you a few seconds on your recall. And the last thing I want to cover before we move on is it's partly a combo, but mainly a concept where if you're playing for the all-in, 9 times out of 10, it's better to lead with Flash E than QE. And the two reasons for that being, one, Flash is much harder to react to than Q, right? Because Q has the travel time. So a Flash E is much harder for them to dodge or like flash away from. And secondary, after you hit the stun, if they want to dash away or flash away, it's much easier to follow with Q compared to Flash because it's a point click ability and the range is longer than Flash. So I've got a good example here where this Poppy has many cancels to my combo. So I have to lead by auto-attacking the minion twice to stack the ulti, start my E, and if I were to just QE him right now, he would W and walk away and my kill chance is lost. But instead, I lead with Flash, get my full damage down, and then he blows everything to survive, but this whole time I've held on to my Q. And I'm waiting, the second his W expires, it's just a free kill. So if you were to take this concept into your games, where leading with Flash over Q and following up with the Q, I feel like you'll need a lot more solo kills consistently overall. Up next we'll dive into team fighting. Now with Jax and team fights, most of the time, not every time, but a lot of the time, you want to be either flanking or fighting from the side of the fight. Say they're upriver here, you could be fighting from here, that's fine. Or here, that's fine. But for this example, they are heading back to the mid lane, and Ben's got a good flank, so he's going to look to take it here. Now, what I see a lot of people make the mistake of doing is they think, alright, I've got the flank, I can get onto them, I need to dive on the backline right now. But Ben knows if he dives right now, they're going to turn on him, and his team can't help him at all, right? It's just a bad look if he were to go now. So should he just give up his position and go back to the front? Like, no. He's going to hold his position here and put pressure on the enemy team and wait for them to mess up. He's just keeping his space from Maokai and Alistair, while making their backline extremely scared to hit his teammates. And now they choose, alright, we can't turn on these guys, we have to turn on him. But that's where Jax thrives, right? When champs jump on him and he's got all of his spells up, his E, his Q, he's fine. Tristana's wasted his W, his ulti, his E, everything, and Jax is still like 100% okay. Now he even notices his teammate int, but still that doesn't make him compromise his position. He's still holding his flank, having a high amount of discipline on his abilities. And look, as soon as Maokai wastes his Q, Jax knows, and his W, now it's Jax's time to go in, and he flashes and dives on the backline. He was holding his abilities and waiting for the enemy to waste all of their spells before he fully committed. And that's why he's the best Jax in the world, right? And it's something you can learn from him and apply in your game set. Just because you have a flank doesn't mean you need to dive onto their head every time. You can wait for them to make a mistake, like position worse or waste abilities. Especially if they already know you're there, you don't have to go. If they don't see you and you've got an angle to get like a 4-man stun, and your team can follow up, then of course it's good. But if they see you, you don't need to compromise your position. You don't need to go in. You just need to play patiently and wait for them to mess up. I have another example of this versus an even better team where Ben's flanking from the side, right? He couldn't get in from the back, so he went from the side, which is fine. We touched on that earlier. And Rakan's noticed him, and now they're in a standoff. Rakan can't look here to ulti his teammates, or Ben gets a free access to the backline. So they're having a standoff. So Ben's objective now, in his mind, is to bait Rakan's spells, which he does. He baits the W, the R, baits Wukong's time, flashes out, and then comes back in. Now, it might look like he's like inting, getting caught wasting flash, but now Rakan has no spells to follow up the rest of this fight. Like, Wukong's ulting in with no Rakan abilities, so his team has no threat of dying. And now he takes it a step further. He goes back in, baits Rakan W again, and even later on in the fight, he pops E and walks at Xayah. His intention's not to kill Xayah, it's to bait her abilities, that's why he's not queuing onto her. So he holds his Q, stuns, Q's away, burns the Xayah ulti, Zhonya's. Beautifully played team fight, but the main point is, he's done no damage this fight, but in my opinion he carried the whole fight. Because he wasted Wukong's time, he burned all of Rakan's spells, 2 rotations of them, and even burned Xayah's spells. This is a fed Xayah, level 16, and Xayah did no damage this fight, purely because he was respecting what Ben can do. Even though Ben had no chance of solo killing him in that fight, he had to respect him. So, in my opinion, even on Jax, you don't have to be 5-0 to carry. You can have such high impact in games just from knowing what you're doing in these team fights. Up next, we're going to be covering side laning. Now, of course, Jax is extremely strong in the side lane. However, I see a lot of people fall into the trap of side laning without intention. So to go deeper into that, there are two main purposes of side laning. The first one is, can I get something in front of my opponent 1v1, whether that be towers, enemy camps, or even just pinning them under the tower? What I mean by pinning them is you push the wave in as far as you can, as close to his tower as you can, make him answer it, and then you fog of war to mid, so the enemy team is scared. Is this guy going to flank me? Is he going to just run up the river and gank me if I try to hit the tower? It just puts pressure on them. However, out of those three, obviously the most pressuring is breaking the tower in front of the guy, killing him, or eating the camps. But that's always useful as well as a backup if you can't get that much. And the second point of side laning is pressuring them to send extra teammates to deal with you. So if your opponent can't handle you 1v1, high chances he's pinging for his teammates to come, he's calling his jungler, and that alleviates a lot of pressure on the map. If you're surviving 2-man ganks, 3-man ganks, your team, in theory, they won't always do it because it's solo queue, but in theory, they should be getting a lot. So the main point of this is I want you to be side laning not just for farm or not just to kill your lane opponent. I want you to have one of these two intentions in mind to have higher impact in your games. So right here we've got a really good example of both the concepts we just covered, where this player, RNG Breathe, he's in a high rank solo queue game. He's versus Faker and Ongshim. Basically it's a high level game, and all of his teammates are doing poorly and spam FFing. Now, for 99% of players, this would be a unwinnable game. By using the concepts we covered earlier, Breeve's able to carry this game. Now, to start off, I want you to notice his build, the one we talked about in the start of the video. He didn't go for Sundera, Black Cleaver, full team fighting. He knew team fights is basically a 0% chance they can win a team fight by looking at the enemy, Zeri Lulu, Karzik, they're all just so fed. He has to put all his money into split pushing, and that's what he did. Triforce, Bork, and eventually Hullbreaker. He spent all his resource to be as strong as possible in the side lane. Now let's move on. He sees here the next objective spawning is Dragon, and if you were to go there and try to fight it, the chance they get aced is almost 100%. So instead of that, he pushes side lane and doesn't ignore what's happening on the map. He's keeping an eye on it, but for the most part, he's giving Dragon for gold and pressure on the map. He's warning the enemy jungle, and he's making them respond to him. If they don't answer him here, he could pressure TF3, but he knows they're going to, so he just pushes the wave and looks to base as fast as possible. Now for his next sequence, he notices the next objective that the enemy team are going to want to take is Baron, because it's spawning next, and they have Cassio, Kha'Zix, Fed 80 carry. Their Baron's really quick, so the chance they go for Baron is almost 100%. So him knowing this, he goes straight to bot, buys more split pushing tech, he's building towards this Hullbreaker, and he knows whoever answers him, he can defeat them 1v1 because he's been trading for gold for the majority of this game, and he's spent all of his money into split pushing. So even if they were to send Cassio to him, he could still beat her 1v1 as well, because he didn't do the Hullbreaker Black Cleaver teamfight build. He can beat anyone 1v1 at this point in the game, despite how fed the enemy team is. So he goes to lane, pushes as fast as he can, and he knows, alright, they're going to be playing for Baron. I can play as aggressively as possible, and even if they do send someone to deal with me, it alleviates a lot of pressure and my team can gain some Baron control. So here he just bashes tower right in front of him because he's a lot stronger than him. He knows he can do this, and just takes the all in. Now, even though he's this far ahead, Olaf is a strong 1v1 champ. If he would have built Sundera Black Cleaver, the chance he can bash tower in front of him is much, much lower. So that's another reason why building this way in a game where you can't win team fights is so important. Now here, he bases because he blows all his HP and mana on the 1v1, and also he has enough money for Hullbreaker. Now I do feel like a lot of players in this case would be looking for the team fight, but he has a lot of discipline and knows the only way they're going to win is through side laning. So he teleports straight back to bot, and he knows the enemy's going to rush Baron in response. Because if they were to base and answer him here, that would be really good. His team can just get full Baron control and maybe even look to do it themselves. Not this game, but in another game, there will be a scenario that will open up Baron for your team. But here he knows the enemy team, they're good players, they have to rush Baron here. And again, he can just bash his tower in front of Olaf with his new Hullbreaker, Triforce, all these split pushing items. There's nothing you can do against him. Keeps going even though he knows they're going to get Baron. He just wants to take as much as he can and push this wave as deep as he can, so that when they base after Baron, they still have to deal with the damage he's done. They have to push the wave all the way out and waste a lot of their Baron time. Now, from this point in the game, I'm sure a lot of players would be tempted to base and deploy back bottom because they see the window to actually break the Nexus, right? They've broken the bot inhib. However, in my opinion, and Breeve's opinion, because he does it, it's much better to deploy top, and the main reason for that is bot lane is already going to pressure by itself with the incoming super waves. So if he's able to push out top as well, that means versus an enemy that's up 10k gold, enemy that's got Baron, they've got top pressure and bot pressure that they have to deal with, and it makes it a lot harder for them to close out the game, right? Only mid lane is available for them to push, and normally with Baron you want to be using 2 waves. So he pushes out top, Cassio has to deal with these super creeps every wave, which takes a decent amount of time. Now from this point, the enemy's scared that if he were to dive this Olaf and kill him 1v1, he could end the game. So they have to send people to deal with him. Even though they're the ones with Baron that want to be breaking inhibs and ending the game, they have to deal with this Jax or they're going to lose. And him knowing this, he's bashing the tower, completely ignoring the Olaf, and like I said, they just send someone to deal with him. And even though he dies here and doesn't get the inhib, he's got the wave all the way here. He's wasted Kha'Zix's time. Kha'Zix has to heal from this point. And his team gets to play 4v3 for a large portion of the Baron Siege, which gives them a lot of avenues to get back into the game. Now, even though it doesn't go that well for them because they're so far behind, he still is doing everything he can to give them opportunities. Now, the way this game ends is basically based on the enemy mistake. However, the opportunity only opens itself up due to the amount of work he did in the side lane earlier. So he sees the opportunity to TP backdoor from the inhib he broke earlier, and he's able to end the game. Now, the reason I wanted to showcase this game in particular is because all 4 of his teammates were basically feeding, trying to FF every 3 minutes, and the game state looked almost unwinnable. However, due to his strong side laning fundamentals, and the 2 concepts we talked about earlier that you saw he applied in multiple points of this game, he was able to win this game purely by himself. Now, this is a high-level Korean Challenger game, and he is still able to expose their mistakes using these side laning fundamentals. Up next, I want to quickly touch on abilities blocked by Jax's E. Now, for the most part, the majority of people do know that Jax's E blocks auto attacks. However, it also blocks abilities. Now, for the most part, these abilities will just be empowered auto attacks. However, there are a lot of them which apply crowd control, which are blocked by Jax's E as well. So I've got them written down here, the key ones to remember: Renekton, TF, Alistair, champs like that. Now, if you're able to block these abilities with your E, you won't just negate the damage, you'll also negate the crowd control. So that's why these are the most important, because all the other empowered autos are just that, they're just extra damage. But these 6 I've got written down here are ones that you need to remember the most, because if you're in a team fight and you can block Renekton's W, Leona's Q, spells like that, and put it on the full cooldown, then your impact on Jax is going to be much higher than it. Now, it wouldn't feel right to talk about it without showing you guys an example, so I've got one here of Bin looking to dive this Renekton, and Bin knows that the only way this dive won't work is if he gets stunned under tower. It'll lead to him dying or losing flash, or the dive's just not working. So with this in mind, he approaches the dive with the intention: I'm going to E as soon as I'm in stun range of Renekton, so he's unable to stun me. And that's exactly what happens. He's able to parry the stun, which blocks all the damage and the stun, as we talked about before, and the dive ends up going really smoothly. Now, in the case of Renekton, you won't be able to parry this every time. A lot of it is just instinct. However, especially if it's Twisted Fate, Alistair, champs like this, it's extremely easy to parry their stun. And the more you build your Jax instinct versus the other ones that are a bit harder, such as Renekton, Leona, as long as you're keeping this fact in mind that you can parry these abilities, you'll start to do so more and more in your games. Now, the main point of why I'm showing this at the end is because these are the main concepts I want to solidify in your mind that you take away when you're either learning or mastering this champion. So the first one being no discipline with spells, mainly Q and E. And we touch on this largely in the teamfight part of the video, but I want to talk about it again because I feel so strongly about it. I see a lot of bad Jaxes, even in pro play at the highest level. They just waste their spells before they see a good opportunity. So I'll give you an example. It's a 5v5 team fight, and you see an opportunity to jump on the AD carry's head with your stun, and you take it, and the enemy jungle support, they all turn on you, you get polymorphed, all this stuff, you're just dead. However, if you were to just watch and pressure them, eventually the Lulu might polymorph someone else, she might W the AD carry, his jungler might dive away to kill someone else, and now if you jump on the enemy AD carry, it's a lot more free because you waited for the support and jungle to make a mistake before you strike. Now for the final piece of the guide, and if you've stuck around this long, respect, you're going to be a lot more knowledgeable than any of the Jaxes you see in your game, so good job. Now, not knowing when to side lane or team fight, we touched on this in the side laning part of the video, but I really want to try to simplify it so it's something that you can apply in your games without overcomplicating it. So the main point is, I want you to think before you just walk to an objective or walk to an area where a team fight will be, if the chance of winning this team fight is extremely high. If the answer is no, I want you to think, can I get something in the side lane? And if the answer is yes, you should be looking to gain that advantage in the side lane and communicating to your team not to fight through pings, chat, whatever you want to use. But you mainly want to just be thinking about which one you want to apply. And if the answer is no to both, you can't team fight or side lane. To be honest, that's when you need to get creative. But majority of the time, if you're just going to get destroyed in the side lane, you should look to team fight anyway. So for the not thinking about first sequence in lane, we mainly touched on this in the laning part of the video. However, this one is quite easy to keep in mind because a lot of this thought process of how do I want to play my lane phase out before my first base, you can do in champ select and loading screen when there's no pressure on you. So for this one, I want to keep it fresh in your mind because it's something a lot easier to apply than the rest of the concepts where you have to be in the game to actually apply them. Now, feeling pressure to TP when you'll get more from side laning. We didn't go through this one too much, a little bit in the side laning part. However, I want you to keep this in your mind because I notice a lot of players, they feel like even though they could be getting something in the side lane in the next 30 seconds in the next minute, if they see a fight on the screen, they choose to teleport instantly. Now, this one is one of the hardest to get used to because it is always better to teleport if you're going to win the team fight, right? If you're going to get an ace, kill 3 or 4 people, you should be teleporting. But if the fight looks like you're just TPing to save your teammate, or your AD carry gets one shot and you're TPing in after, 9 times out of 10 you shouldn't be TPing in the first place. You should keep your pressure in the side lane and try to backping your team and make sure there's no other casualties. So to simplify that, TP for aggressive players where you know you're going to ace the team, but for defensive players where it looks bad and you're just trying to save someone, be a lot more careful before you TP. And the final and easiest to implement part of this whole guide, just take Cosmic Insight. The value you're going to get from your lower TP and flash cooldown will just far outweigh any value you're going to get from bone plating or boots or anything else like that. Alright, let's wrap it up here. And one more thing I want to say before I go is I'll be making a lot of content like this from now on. So if there's any champion or concept you want me to cover, feel free to let me know. And yeah, thanks for watching. Catch you later.